This is Jane Davenport. She's the senior attorney with the group Defenders of Wildlife on this Earth Day, talking about conservation efforts. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
How would you describe your group to other people?
Defenders of Wildlife is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to conserve native animals and plants in their native habitats. So we are laser focused on protecting biodiversity.
What does biodiversity mean?
Biodiversity means the amazing range and number of species we have on this planet. We are in a situation where we are losing species faster than we can even describe them. Absolutely, we need to protect all the pieces, parts of our ecosystems in order to thrive as one species on a healthy planet.
I suppose we hear about a lot of species, their endangerment, but is there a particular one that people may not know about that you would highlight?
I think I'd like to bring up the North Atlantic right whale, which is a species of whale that is only found in the waters of the United States and Canada. And we are down to fewer than 360 surviving whales, and people don't understand that a lot of our whale species have not yet recovered from the era of industrial whaling, and yet these large whale species provide tremendous ecosystem benefits. For example, they help fertilize plankton at the surface, which is the basis of the food chain. So we cannot have healthy oceans, we cannot have healthy fisheries unless we protect our large whale species. And unfortunately, we are just losing them to fishing gear entanglements and to vessel strikes. So this is, as a land-based animal, people don't necessarily think about what's going on in the oceans, but we have to protect our oceans and our ocean wildlife.
I suppose taking a look at that species and others, that would fall under the large umbrella of the Endangered Species Act.
Absolutely.
Where does it stand as of today, and particularly what has this administration done to protect who's under it, or the animals that are under it?
For the Endangered Species Act in general?
Yes.
So the Endangered Species Act celebrated its 50th anniversary last year, and it is our flagship law for protecting imperiled species in this country. And it's had an amazing track record of bringing species back from the brink of extinction, including our national symbol, the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, the American alligator. This administration has recently published new regulations, updated regulations to implement the statute. And some of that was great, and we're very appreciative of what the Biden administration did, bringing back protections for threatened species, for example. However, it was also a lost opportunity in a lot of ways. We're very disappointed that the administration did not take the opportunity to put back better protections for critical habitat, which is the habitat that species need in order to recover.
Protections such as what?
Such as consideration and protection when humans are moving forward with actions like building a highway or, exploring for energy sources. We need to make sure there's a balance in all of our projects between accomplishing human objectives and ensuring that we are not wiping out species and their habitats in the process.
Are there standards usually already established when going forward with those projects to see what the impact would be on wildlife?
Yes, there is what's called a consultation process when a federal agency is approving a project that may affect wildlife, and it could be we are approving a new forest management plan. We're approving a fisheries management plan. We're giving a loan to support a highway project. That federal agency has to come to either the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service, depending on the species, and engage in this interagency consultation to say, what are the effects on the species going to be? Is it going to result in jeopardy to the survival and recovery of this species, and how can we avoid that? How can we put mitigation measures into place? How can we get what we want, but in a way that protects species and critical habitat? So that consultation process is how we reconcile the needs of human objectives with the needs of imperiled species.
This is Jane Davenport of Defenders of Wildlife joining us on this Earth Day. And if you want to ask her questions about how wildlife is protected and things associated with that, you can call us on the lines. It's 202-748-8000 for the Eastern and Central time zones, 202-748-8001 for the Mountain and Pacific time zones. If you want to post your question or comment via text, you can do that at 202-748-8003. We are told that the Endangered Species Act, 1,662 species that are currently protected, 388 threatened species, 1,200 plus endangered ones. As numbers go, how do those numbers compare to species overall? What's protected?
Well, we are in the middle of a global biodiversity extinction crisis, right? There's twin crises that we face, both the extinction crisis and the climate crisis, and they are related to each other. And globally, we are at risk of losing 1 million species. We're in another era of extinction, just as serious as an asteroid hitting the planet. So in the United States, we're very fortunate to have this law, the Endangered Species Act, that is one of the strongest in the world for protecting species, both within the United States and species that are in foreign countries. So some of those species that are included in that number are species that don't exist in the United States, but they can still benefit from the protections of the Endangered Species Act. For example, if the species is popular in international trade, the endangered species can help mitigate that for species that are imported into the United States.
As you talked about the balance of preserving species, I imagine that for someone who's trying to build a road or a building or develop a land, when they run into protections issues, they will say, well, because of these rules, I can't achieve these goals I want. How do you strike that balance between the need for development in some areas and the need for protection?
I think in many cases, there's a lot of fear and misinformation around that very subject. And as a matter of fact, Defenders of Wildlife several years ago examined 90,000 of those consultations that I mentioned, where the federal agency involved in a project and the wildlife agency consulted. And in exactly 0 of those consultations did the project get shut down or, was unable to proceed. So basically the consultation process is all about making it work, both for the project, the proposed project, and for the species and its habitat. So it's a false choice to say we can only have one or the other. We can have both thriving economic development as well as thriving species and habitats.
And then, so when do groups like yours get involved?
When things aren't going right. So is one situation, certainly. So at Defenders, we use a variety of tools in the toolbox, right? We certainly work on the Hill. We work with our allies and our champions in Congress to advocate for especially appropriations, because as an amazing a statute as the Endangered Species Act is, it's desperately underfunded. What we say is that the ESA is starving. It's not broken. It basically needs triple the appropriations it's getting right now to ensure that species recover, which is the point of the statute, not to keep species on life support, but to restore them to health. We work through the courts. We litigate. That's one of the things that I do. And sometimes it's opposed to the federal government, and sometimes we intervene on behalf of the federal government when the government has done the right thing but is facing a challenge. We work directly in the field. One of our flagship programs is about promoting coexistence, so that, for example, if a wolf attacks and kills livestock, that's real harm for the farmer or the rancher. So we work in the field to promote coexistence by putting up fencing, by having guard dogs be present to deter the wolves. So there's a lot of ways in which, again, talking about a false choice, it's a false choice to say we can either have wildlife or we can have human interest. There's lots of ways to coexist and make sure that both sets of needs are fulfilled.
Jane Davenport of Defenders of Wildlife joining us for this conversation. Our first call for you comes from Tina. She is in Maine. You're on with our guest. Good morning. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I'm so excited about this program today. I've been volunteering to help monitor the piping plover, where they're migrating, they're landing on our beaches. And again, this is my third year. I work with Audubon Society here in the Portland area, Fish and Game in Maine. I realize I've learned so much about these beautiful little birds. They look so delicate, but they're very hardy, and they migrate here. They land on our beaches, and as volunteers, we go out. I'm working with the Scarborough town of Scarborough, Maine, and we have a program. And we volunteer. We work about 3 days, three times per day. With shifts, and we educate people that are walking the beaches. We educate folks with dogs. We have to implement, try to remind them gently and kindly that their dogs should be leashed when there's the plovers around. Again, they're trying to build their nests. They've been matching up. Soon babies, the eggs will be hatched, and that's a real crucial time. Again, there's dogs on the beach, other critters, other predators. So, but I guess the good news is every year they do the count, and I guess there's other states in the Northeast, New Jersey and Massachusetts. Maine leads the way, where because of the great effort of so many volunteers in southern Maine, from maybe the Yorks, Algonquin, Maine, up to mid-coast around Reed State Park, our numbers are growing. The babies fledge basically from mid-July, end of July to August.
Tina, thank you. Let me stop you there. Thank you for the call and the importance of volunteers that she brought up.
Absolutely.
But go ahead, Ms. Davenport.
And, today is Earth Day, and every day should be Earth Day, right? But today is a day that around the world people are engaging in exactly these kinds of voluntary efforts, whether it's monitoring and protecting piping plovers, which you're doing, which sounds amazing, whether it's protecting sea turtle nests on beaches, or whether it's doing a cleanup in a park or a stream. So I appreciate what you're doing, Tina, and I applaud you for doing it, and the world needs more citizen conservationists
What
like
is
you.
a piping plover?
A piping plover is a shorebird.
Okay.
So they're the ones that sort of skitter along the edge of the beach. They're super cute. And as Tina said, they're really amazing birds because they just look like just these, little tiny skittery critters, but they make this amazing migration. And as many shorebirds do, when they reach our beaches, they need to have food sources, right? So one of the efforts that Defenders has made is to protect horseshoe crabs, which their eggs provide a food source for piping plovers and red knots and other threatened shorebirds. And, we have to protect these species throughout their habitat, right? It's not enough just to protect them in Maine or North Carolina or Florida or wherever they might land. These species travel thousands of miles, so we have to be cognizant not only of local impacts, but impacts throughout their range.
This is from Tommy. Tommy is in North Carolina. Good morning.
Yes. We sat there and we went to Mexico, and this has been about 6 years, 7 years ago, and they sat there and they was talking about China was taking more whales than what they're supposed to be. And the United States cannot help keep these animals incorrect and stop China from killing and destroying them. And that is most of our problem, is other countries take advantage of our stuff and our wildlife to make their stuff more satisfied and feed off of things that they shouldn't even feed off of, and take their oil and make all kinds of perfume and everything else. But, hey, it's no big deal about it because they won't put no sanctions against it. Hey, because there's too many people in Congress wanting to vote against it. Hey, and that's just like our president, Biden.
Okay. Tommy in North Carolina.
So international trade in wildlife products around the world is definitely a leading cause of risk to species. And the Endangered Species Act is a very important tool that we have in the United States that can help combat that trade, as well as other statutes that we have that can combat that trade, because the U.S. can be a big hub for not only wildlife products shipped out, but wildlife products imported, as well as transportation to across the United States and to and from other countries. So we definitely need the support of our members of Congress to fight wildlife trafficking wherever it originates. And fortunately, we do have the tools to fight that. But like I said earlier, we need better funding to make that enforcement more effective.
I think it's the Fish and Wildlife Service that manages the Environmental Protection, the Species Act. How much do they get currently for that? And what's the figure that you're seeking, or at least your organization is seeking for that?
So there's two agencies that administer the Endangered Species Act: the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is part of NOAA. And our numbers show that we need about $850 million a year, if I have that right, which is about, they're getting about a third of that every year. And unfortunately, what that means is, as I mentioned earlier, the point of the Endangered Species Act is not to keep species in the ICU, right? It's to recover them, like the bald eagle, to the point where statutory protections are no longer needed. But unfortunately, of those species that you mentioned earlier, the 1,600 plus, many of them get less than $1,000 a year for recovery, and some of them don't get any. So they're stuck in the ICU because the agencies don't have the money they need to do what the statute directs them to do and get these species to the point of recovery.
Earlier this year, a group of Republicans released their own effort on conservation, at least the way they saw it, the American Wildlife Habit Conservation Act. One of the things they said that states have to have more of a say in how management is done versus the federal government. That's a broad generalization, but what did you think about the introduction of the act?
I can't speak to the act particularly, but what I will say is, first, the Endangered Species Act already has a robust mechanism for cooperation between the states and the federal government. And states play a critical role, not only in protecting endangered and threatened species, but also in helping to ensure that species don't get to that point in the first instance. And then also, secondly, like I said before, we need to fund the Endangered Species Act because that will also help the federal government help the states implement critical protections and, really enhance that cooperation effort.
It was Washington State's Republican Dan Newhouse. When they unveiled the act, he talked about why it's a better approach, at least in his mind, versus the Endangered Species Act. I want to play a little bit of what he had to say, get your response to that.
Sure.
While noble in its intent, you know that the Endangered Species Act in so many ways has failed in its mission to recover and delist species, and instead, unfortunately, in some instances, has been used as a tool to control the rights of private landowners. We have to improve species conservation efforts by empowering state and local-led efforts and avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to species recovery. What works to recover a species in my state of Washington may not work in the great state of Arkansas or Georgia or Montana. The America's Wildlife Habitat Conservation Act, always easy to say, delivers critical support to the individuals on the ground who have been tasked with preserving and restoring at-risk habitats to better manage those species.
So that was part of his argument. Ms. Davenport, how do you respond to that?
Well, I disagree with the premise that the Endangered Species Act is a one-size-fits-all approach. First of all, everything that happens under the ESA has to be based on the best available scientific and commercial data. That's a statutory requirement. And by definition, that means there is no one-size-fits-all approach because species and their habitats are different. So, there's no, uniform, a species is listed, here's everything that we're going to do to protect it. It is always on a case-by-case basis. Second, as I mentioned previously, there's already a robust mechanism for cooperation between the federal government and the states. And in most cases, the states are critical partners in conservation. And third, again, getting back to the funding, we need triple the appropriations we have right now so that the Endangered Species Act can do the job that it was always meant to do and recover species to the point where they don't need the statute's protections anymore.
We're joined, by the way, by Jane Davenport with Defenders of Wildlife. She's their senior attorney. Let's hear from Cal in Oklahoma. Hello.
Good morning. My query relates to the conversion to alternative energy sources. One would think that with the mantra of drill, baby, drill, that Biden has been completely opposed to that. The reality is that oil production is up about 18% during his time in office as president. What do you see as far as the national or worldwide trends for alternative energy production in light of the continuing use of oil and natural gas?
I think that's a great question. I think that it's really clear that the path we're on of continuing the trend and increasing the trend towards fossil fuel production in this country is the wrong path forward. And that is why Defenders is a huge proponent of renewable sources of energy. That being said, renewable sources of energy, whether it's onshore or offshore wind or solar or any other kind of renewable energy, all projects like that can have effects on wildlife. And that is why we are so focused on making sure that renewable energy projects are sited appropriately and are managed and mitigated appropriately so that we can have renewable energy and healthy, thriving wildlife populations.
A viewer from X follows up on the question about the whales that you were talking about.
Great.
They asked that, why are all those whales dying? Is there some relation to the windmills and other machines like submarines with sonar increasing in numbers? This viewer adding that this is highly concerning.
I agree that what's going on with the whales is highly concerning. It's actually not true that it's offshore wind that is the source of the problem. If you've ever heard the saying, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses and not zebras, the risks that our large whales face are three, but two caused by humans that are top of mind are entanglements in fishing gear and vessel strikes. And in fact, on the East Coast, both North Atlantic right whales as well as Atlantic humpback whales are currently in the midst of what we call unusual mortality events. And one of the biggest causes of those is vessel strikes. And that is why we are so adamant that the Biden administration needs to finalize a proposal to expand vessel speed protections for these large whales by slowing boats down, just like a slow speed zone when kids are on their way to school. When you have slower speed limits, you can get where you're going, but you're not going to run over and kill a whale.
Would those slower speed zones be in just where the concentration of whales would be? How would that be managed?
That's exactly right. Again, going back to that school zone analogy, we have those twice a day, right? Mm-hmm. When kids are on their way to or coming home from school. So what the vessel speed rule does is it has seasonal speed limits. When whales are migrating north-south and vessels are traveling east-west, we have zones. In the southeast, it's in the calving season from November to April, and then they move away from there, so the speed zone is no longer in effect. So it coordinates with where the whales are, when they're there, and when they're most at risk of vessel strikes.
Let's hear from David. David joins us from Michigan for our guests. David, good morning. Go ahead, you're on.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Pedro, for taking my call. I have a little story where I protected some animals. One day my wife was going to work, and the car just didn't run right, shaking and almost stalling out. I looked under the hood, and sure enough, some of my wires to the motor were chewed up. I didn't know what it was. I looked in the motor, and I saw rat droppings. So I took it to the auto mechanic, and for $260, he fixed it. I did not kill any rats in the process of this, and I used peppermint oil, made my spray, and I sprayed the motor, and so far, so good. There were no rats killed because God's creations, the rats are a part of that circle of life, and for birds of prey, they pick up those animals and they eat them. Cats also. So no rats were harmed in this little story. But I want people to know, if they ever have that problem with their automobile where the wires were chewed, they can use peppermint oil spray, and the rats hate peppermint oil. But there is only one rat that I will not protect, and that's Donald J. Trump.
Okay, that's David in Michigan.
I wonder if the car smells better with the peppermint oil. But I think the caller raises a really great point, and that is, we need to be aware of the unintentional consequences of what we do. If we're trying to kill rats or mice with poison, what happens to the hawks, the eagles, the foxes that eat those? So, we can't just go about our lives and poisoning critters that are inconvenient, like rats and mice, without thinking about the effects on the larger ecosystem.
There was action by the Biden administration on something called PFAS chemicals. What are they, and how could they impact wildlife?
I am not going to be able to remember what PFAS stands for. Essentially, this is not an issue I track as closely because I'm focusing on wildlife, but EPA is regulating PFAS in large part because of human health concerns. With these, forever chemicals are in our water supply, they are being ingested by people, and, a huge range of health effects that we've just begun to scratch the surface. And of course, whatever happens in the human environment is also going to happen to wildlife as well. So again, it's not my issue, but I do think it's a huge step forward in recognizing that we cannot just continue to use chemicals or make plastics and so forth with abandon because of the forever effects on both humans and wildlife.
This is Mark. Mark is in New Jersey. Hello.
Hello. Good morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. I want to wish everybody on the planet a very happy Earth Day. To me, this is the most important day of the year, and we should celebrate our Mother Earth every single day, and we can all do something. I made a commitment to use less fossil fuels many years ago, and I'm doing well. I have my solar panels, I have my plug-in hybrid, but I want to do even more. Now I'm really trying to cut down on plastics, which is a difficult one, but I'm going to keep going. And I am a member of Defenders for Wildlife. I appreciate the work you do, Ms. Davenport. Keep it up, and let's clean up this planet. It's the only one we have, and we should worship Mother Earth as the true God. Take care.
Thank you, Mark. As they say, there is no planet B, right? And I think Mark, your point is very timely because the theme of this year's Earth Day is people versus plastics. And I think everything that we can do to reduce our dependence on plastics is vitally important. First of all, because plastics are made from fossil fuel. But second, they are lasting in the environment and having effects that we have just begun to understand. We've all seen, for example, with sea turtles, the horrible pictures of a sea turtle trapped in the plastic six-pack rings, or whales that have washed up on beaches dead because their stomachs are full of plastic bags and fishing rope. But what people often don't understand is that those big plastic bottles, especially in the ocean, or coming from our laundry, those little tiny microplastics that we can't even see with the naked eye, those are building up in the ocean. In fact, I just read that there are more particles of microplastics in our ocean than there are stars in the Milky Way. And guess what? The base of the food chain, the plankton, the fish larvae, they're eating those microplastics. And then, of course, little fish get eaten by big fish, and big fish get eaten by bigger fish. And then here we are as humans at the top of the food chain, and we're eating big fish and shellfish, and we're ingesting those microplastics. So I applaud you for everything you're doing, and we all need to reduce and hopefully one day eliminate our dependence on plastics.
The organization's website, by the way, is defenders.org. Jane Davenport serving as senior attorney for the organization. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We will continue on our theme on Earth Day, talking about the topic of climate change, joined by former Republican Congressman Bob Inglis, the head of Republic N, to discuss what Washington and industry players should be doing to combat climate change. Later on in the program, an interview with two political commentators who work largely on social media, Stephen Bunnell and Brad Palumbo, joining us later in the program.